All right, after the Pentateuch in the Jewish scriptures, or the Tanakh, is the Nevi'im, which are the prophets. These are the prophetic writings in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. I'm using these words all in the same way. There are prophets like Elijah and Elisha, and they would go to a king of Israel and say, what you're doing is wrong, you need to change your ways or God will smite you. It was this kind of thing. Those collections of books that are about the prophets are called prophets, or Nevi'im is the Hebrew word. The last section, Ketuvim, again, this is a Hebrew word. It just means writings. It includes things like the Psalms. Probably most of you have heard of Psalms or Song of Solomon. There's a book in the Old Testament called Proverbs. These are all considered part of the writings, or the Ketuvim. This canon was completed about 100 BCE. BCE means before the Common Era. CE means Common Era. Now, just so you know, BCE and CE have replaced in scholarly literature the designations BC and AD. BC means before Christ. AD means Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord. The reason why BCE and CE have replaced those is because in the year of the Lord is not very religiously friendly to people who aren't Christians. So let's say I'm Jewish. I'm actually not going to tell you what I am, but let's say I'm Jewish and I'm talking about this is the year 2010 AD. What I'm literally saying there is it's 2010 in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. But if I'm Jewish, Jesus is not my Lord, so it doesn't seem fair to me to say in the year of our Lord, which is again AD, Anno Domini. So instead of using BC and AD, before Christ and Anno Domini, scholars have switched to BCE and CE, before the Common Era and Common Era. It's the same number, so 2010 CE is the same as 2010 AD. 200 BCE is the same thing as 200 BC. It's just different terminology, same numbers. So when I say here that the canon was completed around 100 BCE, what that means is that someone or some group got together and made this anthology, including the Torah, including the Nevi'im, and including the Ketuvim. They grouped it all together, and this anthology became the official selection of readings, or the official canon. Now again, this is called the Tanakh by Jews, and it's an acronym. By Christians, it's usually called the Old Testament. We'll get to what that means here in a few minutes, but Old Testament, Tanakh means the same thing. Although Christians don't usually put it in the same order. Christians don't usually use Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim as section headers, but it includes the same body of writings, except Christians call it the Old Testament instead of the Tanakh. Usually I will call it the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible rather than Old Testament, and I'll explain why in a minute. So let's move on. Deuterocanonical or apocryphal texts. Deuterocanonical technically means second canon, which means it's a canon that has a secondary status. It's canonical for Roman Catholics, but it has a secondary status. So for Roman Catholics, there's the Old Testament, there's the New Testament. Those are the two main sections in their canon. But they also have the Deuterocanon, or the second canon, that's in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because it's deuterocanonical, it has a secondary status. It's not as important as the New Testament and the Old Testament. It includes books like Tobit, Judith, Maccabees, and others. Now in addition, you'll see here there are additions to Esther, additions to Daniel. Now, in the version of the Bible that you have gotten, if you've gotten this from the bookstore at Stack, this is a Catholic version, and it has Tobit, Maccabees, Judith, etc. In addition, it has the additions to Esther, the additions to Daniel. Now what's interesting about the additions is that Esther and Daniel are in the Tanakh, they're in the Roman Catholic canon, they're in the Protestant canon. However, there are these additions that are only in The additions are only in the Roman Catholic canon, and here's why. Those texts in the Hebrew Scriptures were written in Hebrew, like Esther and Daniel were originally written in Hebrew. The Greek copies of that have these extra sections in Esther and Daniel, for instance. Those additional sections only appear in the Greek and not in the original Hebrew texts. So we know that there were later additions. When somebody was translating a version of the text from Hebrew and translating it into Greek, somehow somebody added stuff when they were translating it into the Greek. And these additions to Esther and additions to Daniel are these Greek sections that are not in the original Hebrew section. Because of that, like, Protestants don't count them as authoritative because they see them as later additions. However, Catholics do see them as authoritative, and they do appear in the Roman Catholic canon. Let's move on to the New Testament. Now, testament technically means covenant, and covenant technically means something like a contract or an agreement.